In chapter 5, God reveals another side to his wrath. He shows that he is highly reluctant to bring this judgment upon his people. This chapter shows him, in a sense, defending himself for the action he is about to take. It is almost as if he is compelled, as if, horrific though it will be, the world would make even less sense if he did not carry out the sentence. In verse 1, the Lord tells Jeremiah to run throughout Jerusalem and see if he can find just one person who does what is right and seeks truth, so that he might pardon the city. This recalls Abraham in Genesis 18 pleading with the Lord over Sodom, where Abraham asks that if only 10 righteous people are found there, God will spare the whole city. But the Lord knows that not even one would be found. Sure enough, Jeremiah gets no response from the common people, but he puts this down to their ignorance. The rich will know better. But whatever the rich do know, they, like the poor, do not know the way of the Lord, the law of their God. They have both broken the yoke. Again, the disobedient and wayward people are portrayed as animals. In chapter 2, they were portrayed as a camel and a donkey in heat. Here, it is an ox breaking and escaping its restraints. But the instrument of their punishment is also portrayed as an animal. In verse 6, we have a lion from the forest and a wolf from the desert. A leopard is watching their cities. The word watching here is the same used in chapter 1, shoked, which was a play on words with almond. It is more than merely looking or seeing. It implies focused monitoring, either for defense or for attack. In chapter 31, the Lord will refer to Jeremiah's commission in chapter 1, and, using this same word, shoked, will say that whereas he was watching over his people to pluck up and break down, now he is watching over them to plant and to build. Again in verse 7, the Lord asks, "How can I pardon you?" He then describes their idolatry in terms of adultery and asks in verse 9, "Shall I not punish them for these things, says the Lord, and shall I not bring retribution on a nation such as this?" Thus again, the Lord is showing not just that the judgment is fully deserved, but that he is reluctant to do it. He repeats these questions in verse 29. God is like a father reasoning with a disobedient son, saying, "You have done this and this. What am I supposed to do now? How can I ignore what you've done? Look at the position you have put me in." Besides, as we saw in Joshua and Judges, God punished nations for their idolatry, sexual vices, and violence. How then can God let Israel sin like them forever? To be sure, God has given them special warning with the prophets, but he has also given them special instruction with the law. Judgment must come. There are also in this chapter and the next a number of critical references to the current prophets. In verse 13, they are nothing but wind, and the word is not in them. Verse 12 summarizes the message they have been giving out. God will not act. There will be no consequences. But, as he says in verse 14, because they have prophesied all this, he will make the words he put into Jeremiah's mouth in chapter 1 into a fire which will consume them, the people, like wood. The failure of the prophets is described in verses 30 to 31 as an appalling and horrible thing. The prophets are false. The priests do what the prophets tell them, and the people love it this way. So everyone is happy. But as God then asks, what will you do when the end comes? In 6:10, Jeremiah asks, who can he speak to? Who will listen? The word of the Lord is an object of scorn. They take no pleasure in it. But, as he says in verse 11, I am full of the wrath of the Lord. I am weary of holding it in. The other prophets are full of wind. Jeremiah is bursting with fire. Verses 13 to 15 again criticize the prophet and the priest, who, for greed, lead the people astray with nice, reassuring messages of comfort. They will all fall together. In verse 16, the Lord appeals once more, "Stand at the crossroad and look. Ask for the ancient paths where the good way lies, and walk in it, and find rest for your souls." The Israelites are at a point of decision. Which way to go? The path they are on has led them to disaster. Which was the better path? It was the old ones, worn over the centuries because they are good and reliable and pass by pleasant places. God exhorts them, "Walk in these ways, and you will find rest." But they will not. The chapter ends on this note of stubborn refusal. God has made Jeremiah in his prophesying a refiner of metals. But no matter how hot the furnace, how fiercely the bellows blow, the dross is not removed. The metal is worthless and has been rejected.